very, very much. It is certainly my distinct pleasure to be here as part of the Moses Lecture, and appropriately enough on Constitution Day here at the Byrd Center, named after Senator Robert C. Byrd, who played such a prominent role in recognizing this day in its current form. I would be remiss, however, Zach, if I didn't begin by offering one technical correction for the record. Although, strictly speaking, it is accurate that I served a little less than half a year in the Senate back in 2010 to fill the vacancy caused by Senator Byrd. That's not typically how I describe my tenure. I prefer to say that Senator Byrd and I combined to serve over 52 years in the Senate. You can look it up. By that measure, we're one of the longest serving duos in Senate history. In all seriousness, obviously it was and will always remain my enduring privilege to have represented West Virginia in the Senate. To walk into the U.S. Capitol and see my name next to the words West Virginia was simply an honor, and one that I will always cherish. It was not without its own challenges, of course, not the least of which was, of course, being appointed to the seat held for so long and with such distinction by Senator Byrd, a man who, by any objective measure, is a true giant in American history. Someone who served at the highest levels of our government for nearly a quarter of the Republic's existence. Well, think about that. He was a lion of the Senate as an institution, a master of the rules, certainly revered here at home in West Virginia, but equally respected in the corridors of power in Washington. So I was under no illusions about filling his shoes or replacing him during my brief time there. But all I wanted to do, and what I tried to do, was to emulate his work ethic and his commitment to West Virginia, to the American people, and fittingly enough for tonight's conversation, his commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law.
Excuse me, Carte, could you get a little closer to the microphone?
Yes, I'm sorry. Is that better?
A little closer.
Not able to raise it up here. Let's see.
Some of us have hearing problems.
Yeah. How's that? A little better? It's not staying up though. I wonder if I can take it out. Let's see. Is that a little better? Maybe I'll try that. Okay. So, again, emulate his work ethic and his commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law. In Senator Byrd's case, that was a commitment that was born out of a lifetime spent dedicated to learning and studying societies that had come before the United States, and studying the political writers and thinkers and philosophers that influenced our own founders. And that, in turn, that lifetime of study informed Senator Byrd's approach to the debates of the day, public policy debates, constitutional debates, and conversations about what it means to be a citizen. We hear a lot of these conversations today, debating what the Constitution is, what it means, and what it means to be a citizen. And I think all too often, when we talk about it, we only talk about one part, one side of that coin, admittedly a critical part, but not the whole story. Often we will obviously recognize the rights, freedoms, privileges, and liberties that are enshrined in the Constitution and afforded to us as citizens, and with good reason. That's what's great about this country. But what makes our country great, and what keeps our country great and allows those freedoms and liberties to endure, is the other side of the coin of being a citizen. Not just the rights, but the obligations, the responsibilities and duties that we all share to one another, to our communities, to our state, to our country, and to the Constitution itself. And Senator Byrd understood citizenship, that understanding of citizenship, to its core. And he knew that the greatest title that he held was not necessarily majority leader or chairman or even senator, but that of citizen. Because under our system, the power is given to the people. It derives from the people, and citizens in turn have an obligation to ensure that our government is upholding its end of the bargain. In remarks that he gave on Constitution Day in 2006, he talked about these obligations and responsibilities that we have as citizens. First and foremost among which, of course, is to elect our leaders. But Senator Byrd emphasized that our obligations as citizens don't end when the campaign commercials fade from the airwaves, mercifully, usually, in most years. And it doesn't end when the election's over. To the contrary, it's often just beginning. We have an obligation to monitor our leaders, monitor our government, ensure that they are standing up for, defending, and upholding the Constitution. And critically, Senator Byrd emphasized that's an obligation we can only meet by work, by studying the Constitution and its history and what it means. Without that second part, we run the risk of allowing these very freedoms that we cherish to erode. So Senator Byrd emphasized we have to grasp the importance of why power was not concentrated into a single office, but rather separated into three separate, distinct, but co-equal branches of government. If we fail to grasp the importance of the separation of powers, if we fail to appreciate how critical it is that these checks and balances exist, if we fail to understand why the independence of the judiciary is so important to upholding the rule of law, Senator Byrd noted we won't be able to even identify, much less respond when these rights are being threatened. So I would think, in Senator Byrd's estimation, we have to do the work. And that takes more than symbolic gestures, which are fine. You want to put a sticker on your car? That's okay. You want to get "We the People" tattooed on your forearm? That's great too. But the work takes something more. And it takes standing up for the Constitution, even when it's hard, even in the face of opposition, especially in times of crisis, even when you're facing disagreement from your constituents and your supporters. And even in several instances in Senator Byrd's case where he had to stand up to a popular president of his own party. But that's what the Constitution requires. And so there are countless examples where Senator Byrd did precisely that during his long and decorated career. I'd like to talk about one from the mid-1990s, and that was the debate over the Line Item Veto Act. Now, I would encourage everyone to go find a law review article about this very debate in the West Virginia Law Review written by the late Judge Blaine Michael, who was a counselor and a confidant to Senator Byrd, a respected jurist and decorated public servant in his own right. He had served as counsel to Governor Rockefeller in the 70s, and he wrote a law review article that goes into great detail about the debate, what Senator Byrd said, and how he stood up for the Constitution during the course of this debate. It's a really, really interesting read. And I'm drawing a lot from that. Of course, as Bob Dylan said, good writers borrow, but great writers steal. So I'm going to steal from Judge Michael here a little bit. By way of background and introduction, of course, the Constitution sets forth the process and mechanism by which bills become law and are presented to the president. And folks my age remember the cartoons from Schoolhouse Rock about how bills passed into law. But specifically, the presentment clause gives the president options when a bill passes both houses and comes to him. And it says you have one of two options. If the president approves it, he can sign it. If not, he returns it with his objections. It's effectively an all or nothing proposition. The Line Item Veto Act would authorize the president to pick and choose. So a piece of legislation comes to him and he would say, I like this piece, I'll keep that. I don't like this one, I'm going to reduce it. I'm not sure about this, I'm going to mark it out in its entirety. That was what was being debated. I would note several states and state constitutions give governor precisely this type of responsibility. That's how Governor Manchin vetoed a lot of Delegate Doyle's great ideas out of the spending bills back in the day. No, but in all seriousness, the Modern Budget Amendment of 1968 in West Virginia gave the West Virginia governor the ability to go in. He could approve the spending bill, he could reduce the amounts, or he could strike it out in its entirety. But critically, that's never been part of the federal Constitution. And it's never been power that was given to the president. And yet by the 1980s and 90s, it was growing in popularity and seen as a mechanism by which the president could reduce wasteful spending. And that was an argument that resonated with the American public at the time. For as Senator Byrd noted, and tell me if this doesn't sound familiar too, the country was facing a lot of challenges. Deteriorating infrastructure, stagnant economic growth, high unemployment, ballooning annual budget deficits and debt. And so proponents of the line item veto said, let's pass this, give the president the power, it will reduce spending, fight fight waste, fraud, and abuse and give the power to the one person who's won a federal election, been elected by the entire country, who is in a better position, they argued, to make these sorts of decisions, better than the individual representatives of Congress. Now, Senator Byrd had a lot of reservations about the policy arguments behind the line item veto. And he questioned whether it would be effective in truly achieving the aims that its advocates suggested. But more importantly, he opposed it because it was unconstitutional. Unlike the state constitutions that authorize it, the U.S. Constitution simply did not give that power to the president. And to attempt to shift it legislatively like this, in Senator Byrd's estimation, would amount to a shift of power and a transfer to a single office that the founders had determined should remain separate and should remain with Congress, the power of the purse. So Senator Byrd did what he often did. He drew inspiration from history and gave a series of speeches during this legislative debate, drawing parallels between this question of what power should be given to the president and what impact that would have on the country, and the impact that similar developments had had in ancient Rome, suggesting that the weakening of the Roman Senate led to a corresponding decline in the Roman Republic itself, and the concentration of power in an all-powerful executive, Caesar. Critically, in an observation that remains timely, if not timeless, Senator Byrd questioned, or noted rather, that the gravest threat to our republic is not a chief executive that attempts to take power or grasp power. It's the other branches in the people who willingly give it away. So he wrote about Rome. He said the Roman Senate thrust power on Caesar deliberately, with forethought, with surrender, and with intent to escape responsibility. Rhetorically, asking the question, why would you tackle these hard responsibilities when you can give the authority, the power, and perhaps even the blame to someone else? Well, the answer for Senator Byrd was always very simple, because that's what the Constitution requires. Now, unfortunately, he lost that debate in the halls of Congress, and it passed both houses and was signed into law by President Clinton in 1996. But he ultimately won the longer debate. Indeed, the day that the bill passed the Senate, the New York Times noted that it was one of the rare instances in which the oratorical day was clearly carried by a member of the losing side, noting the powerful and persuasive remarks that Senator Byrd gave in defense of the Constitution. But ladies and gentlemen, that's truly what it sounds like. To be a citizen, to be engaged, to be committed, to be a senator. We have that obligation to stand up for the Constitution. But critically, as Senator Byrd noted, that's an obligation we can only meet by doing the work, by staying informed, studying and knowing the history of our founding fathers and the Constitution itself. As he said, to preserve the Constitution, we must be willing to make it work and to make it an active part of our daily lives. So on this Constitution Day, I encourage all of us to take up that charge. Thank you very much.
We're going to open it up to Q&A. So Betsy, our student intern, is going to go around. Please raise your hand and let her know that you'd like to ask a question. And we have about 25 minutes for this portion of the meeting. Thank you.
And I was just kidding. We didn't veto any of Delegate Doyle's.
Yeah, you did.
Am I reading you right to think that Senator Byrd? Am I reading you right to think that Senator Byrd was opposed to modification of the Constitution?
Oh, I don't think so.
We do have amendments.
Right. The line item veto act in that debate was about a statutory authorization that would have bestowed that power on the president without a constitutional amendment. And for Senator Byrd, again, that's what most strongly informed his opposition to it.
Would it be right to think that he would have opposed a constitutional amendment to that effect?
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. No, you promise no hard questions.
No. There's a new book out today, important new book on the history of the Constitution by Jill Lepore called We the People. And her argument is that the Constitution is in terrible trouble mainly because we haven't figured out a way to amend it. What would you think of the chances of and circumstances in which we might actually try to make some changes in the Constitution?
That's a great question, and I saw there was an Atlantic magazine cover story about that book coming out, and I have not had a chance to read it yet because my wife quickly took it for herself. But I don't know. I think it's an interesting question, and historically, it's interesting to consider how that's changed. Today, I think we would all probably agree that it seems exceedingly difficult or unlikely that an amendment could pass, but it happened a lot over the years, and it was a much more frequent, not just occurrence, but part of our constitutional conversation. What would have to change to allow that to happen again? I don't know. But definitely look forward to reading that book.
Thanks. The example that you gave, which was terrific, of the line item veto issue was an example, if I understood the process right, of the Congress essentially actively attempting and then successfully, I guess, voting to give power away to the president, right? And that's part of what Senator Byrd was so against. My view is what we seem to be seeing today is what might be looked at as passively giving power away. In other words, the current president seems to be taking power that is not explicitly given to the president in the Constitution and is either being enabled in doing that, or there's just, at least in terms of Congress, seems to be very little active challenging of doing the things that he's doing. So politically, I can kind of figure out what the difference is, but like, what would Senator Byrd or from your experience, like, what's the different challenge that the country constitutionally is facing when we see that happening?
Well, the most obvious one is the absence of debate. With the Line Item Veto Act, that debate lasted several years. And Senator Byrd, I mentioned the speeches he gave. He gave 14 speeches on the Senate floor opposing it and talking about the parallels with ancient Rome and other historical examples over a course of several months, if a year and a half. Those speeches are, of course, collected in book form, and I would definitely encourage anyone who's interested to take a look. But that at least allowed the public and the people's representatives to engage in a debate. Now, it's a lot easier for people who would want to avoid that kind of debate to have it happen the way it is, where a step is taken, Congress effectively blesses it after the fact or does nothing. And needless to say, the absence of that sort of national conversation about these issues inures to the detriment of our country, I think.
During the time that you and Senator Byrd were in, you all used to take up legislation in committee. Now it seems they don't even bother with that. The leadership just gets together and talks to the members of its own party, whichever party's in power, say, okay, let's throw a bill together and just throw it out onto the floor. Why do you think that is, and what do you think could be done to restore what they keep calling regular order and saying they want it but don't seem to use it?
That's a really tough question. I mean, obviously, the leaders and the chairman retain the discretion to do that if they wanted, but it really speaks to a more difficult underlying question about the incentive structure in place now, right? And what our representatives are incentivized to do and what they're disincentivized from doing. in our name and what sort of political pressures they face. And the reality is that's not one that gives them much pressure. And the challenge is, elections used to be a means to an end. And in campaigns were a means to an end. And if you won, then you got to govern. And then we had those processes in place where you relied on experienced chairmen and members who had expertise in various issues to get a piece of legislation through and work and find compromise where possible. Now, the opposite is true. The theater of governing is a means to campaigns, right? And every day, every committee hearing, every vote, everything, every press release is fodder for the next social media tweet, commercial, whatever the case may be. And that's a difficult fix.
My question is about the 3 co-equal branches of government. I always thought that that was true, and it was in the Constitution. Is it in the Constitution? Because when I talked to Riley Moore, he talks about the unitary president, and I don't understand that process. I don't get where he's coming from, but he's pretty sure about it.
Well, let's see how diplomatic I feel like being after a 5-hour drive today.
Please, don't be diplomatic for me.
I would, on balance, tend to treat Senator Byrd's constitutional scholarship with a little more deference than I would our congressman's. And for my money, obviously, it's clear that they are separate and equal branches. Now, they have different roles and different responsibilities, and the judiciary's role in a lot of the day-to-day governing that we see is more limited, but it doesn't mean it's not equal. The legislature's role, I mean, that's such to Delegate Doyle's question, that's such an interesting observation for a member of one branch to make about another. As Senator Byrd said, and I don't know if I've included in the remarks here, but the role of these branches is obviously to keep an eye on each other, but to jealously guard their own prerogatives too. That tension is how our system is set up to work. And I fear that some of the branches are not doing that.
But does the Constitution specifically say there are 3 co-equal branches?
Well, I think it's contemplated in the powers that they're given, right? One passes the law and has the power of the purse, one administers the laws, and the other gets to determine what the law says.
So that's the rub.
Yeah.
That's why he thinks one way and thinks it's okay.
Maybe I'll just project. I don't know if I need a microphone. Betsy, would you just for the Sure. First of all, I wanted to thank the organizers for this event. Thank you very much. I actually used to run events similar to this back in Russia at the Yeltsin Center, and Constitution Day was one of our biggest days of the year and biggest events. So thank you. I very much appreciate all that you guys have done. Senator, thank you very much for your speech. It was very interesting to hear some of the points. Going back to what I just said about my time back in Russia, Constitution was really like at the core of what I used to do. All the programs, educational programs, outreach programs that we used to do for school kids, our audience was kind of the most important part of my work there. And I know that here in schools you have the introduction to the Constitution. I became a citizen of the US a few years ago and I studied the Constitution. I wish we were reminded of the words of the Constitution a little bit more often, just so that we knew what it was, we knew what our rights were, and we knew what our country is. But again, back in Russia, Constitution is read and interpreted and amended. And one of the questions earlier today was about possibility of amendments here. Well, there, the amendments were about presidential terms and the extension of the presidential terms and the limit on the presidential terms. Here in this country, we obviously have a limit on the presidential terms and how many terms our president can serve. My question to you is, there is currently no limit on the terms for the senators. What's your take on that? and also considering the name of the hall that we are sitting in. With all of the due respect to Senator Byrd, there goes my question.
No, that's a fair question and a great question. Thank you. As Senator Byrd often remarked, we do have term limits, and they're called elections, right? And that's a good thing. I do think the question is a good one to entertain because it goes to some of these other topics we've been talking about, which is how do we change the incentive structure? How do we increase involvement? How do we reduce the influence of money in politics? And, a lot of people have thought that term limits might be one way to do that. I've never thought that it would be a good approach. I tend to adhere more to Senator Byrd's example, but look, I think we need to keep an open mind about all sorts of options like that. And I want to return to an earlier statement you made about civics education. It's such an important thing, and it's like I know you mentioned the committee that I worked on with Sandra Day O'Connor. After her time on the court, she dedicated a significant part of her life to civics education, set up a civics education project in schools throughout the country, and really great program. And then just today, the West Virginia State Bar announced that they are partnering with the National Constitution Center to provide civics education provided by West Virginia lawyers to elementary and middle schools throughout the state of West Virginia. So one of my law partners is on the board of governors of the bar, and he's already signed me up for it, so I'm looking forward to that.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious about the vote that took place on the amendment, on the bill that you were quoting, as to whether or not there was any bipartisanship in support or in disagreement about that bill. It was a Democratic administration. I would suspect that if it happened today, that all the Democrats in the Senate would vote for it and all the Republicans would vote against it, or vice versa, or the other way around. But the question I have is really has to do with the issue of bipartisanship or the lack thereof, and what that does to erode the intent of the Congress, intent of the Constitution, to make the Congress an equal body to the other two. It seems like the lack of bipartisanship really jeopardizes the effectiveness of the Congress itself as an independent body, as a power broker within the government. What do you think about that?
Well, that's certainly an interesting take, and they certainly get a lot less work done without working in a bipartisan fashion, which, to your point, means they're contributing less to this national conversation and to the actual implementation, passing of laws. The vote itself, to go back to your first question, in the House, I think it passed relatively overwhelmingly. In the Senate, it was 69 to 29. I believe the Republicans did have a majority at the time, but there were several Democrats that voted for it. And it had come up for a vote in the preceding years a couple times and had failed. But that year, I believe President Clinton was supporting it. I think most of the Republicans were overwhelmingly supporting it as well, so it passed with pretty safe margins. But yeah, I mean, obviously, the parties should work together. And the Constitution doesn't say much, as Zach said, about Democrats or Republicans. Instead, it talks about citizens and we the people. And we need to recognize not just the humanity in each other, but also that no one has a monopoly on good ideas. But going back to the incentive structure, like so much of what happens up there is designed to be, let me tell one quick story. So during my tenure, obviously, unlike Senator Byrd, everything's determined by seniority. So unlike Senator Byrd, I was number 100 on the totem pole, so you get all the fun duties that nobody else wants to do, including presiding over the Senate itself. So if you're ever watching C-SPAN, there's always one person up there in the chair that they have to kind of tell what to do, because otherwise the gears of government would grind to a halt if they'd left it up to me. But the debate was over a provision that passed in the Affordable Care Act, and it had to do with how certain contractors were treated, like independent contractors, and how they were treated for tax purposes. It was near unanimous that there was an error or a mistake, or at least the impact of it was not what was intended. So everyone wanted to come back and fix it. We got to fix this provision, this 1099 provision, as it affects independent contractors. So let's find a vehicle. So there was a bill that was pending on that would, I think it was a Small Business Act, would provide a lot of access to capital for small businesses that would otherwise not qualify, especially in rural areas. And Democrats were unanimously supporting the bill. Nearly a dozen or more Republicans, I think, were supporting the bill, including former Senator Voinovich of Ohio and others. And it was agreed, and the leaders are working together. This bill, this is a vehicle. We can put an amendment to this bill in, and that fixes the 1099 problem. Okay, so now we schedule for the day, and we're going to determine that one day is set aside for debate just on this amendment. Okay? And so that was the day I was assigned the chair. So I'm sitting up there, and for hours on end, a Democrat gets up and says, you know, we got to pass this amendment. It's so important. It needs to go into this bill. And then a Republican would stand up and say, we can't do this. We have another amendment that we should pass. If this amendment passes, will be the end of the Republic, and vice versa. And on this went. And then it occurred to me, and this was just one day where it happened to be the Republicans doing this. So I don't want to say that they have a monopoly on this sort of behavior, but on this day, countless senators got up and said, we have to pass this amendment. Our version is better. Let's pass it. And if it had passed, they were going to vote against the bill. Right? So if it had passed and become part of the bill, the next day they would have voted it down. So we spent an entire day and hours debating this. For what? And to what end? Just so they could say, again, I put out a press release, or I don't even know if Twitter existed at the time, or whatever social media platform. And too many of the days are taken up with that kind of thing.
I'm just curious, in your view, if you feel as though we're in a constitutional crisis.
Also, how diplomatic do I feel today? Well, sure. Right? I mean, when laws are passed, spending directives are passed that say we should have mine health and safety offices across the state of West Virginia, and they're shut down, contrary to the votes of Congress, and 200 mine inspectors are no longer on the job to inspect the safety of coal mines in West Virginia, and nothing is done about it, that seems like a crisis to me.
Especially after coal was brought back to West Virginia. I mean, really, right?
If they put it back in the ground, you said? No, but look, there's still a lot of active coal mines in the state and a lot of coal miners, and they depend on these inspectors to keep the mine safe. You know, NIOSH in Morgantown, doing black lung screening, same thing. Now, Senator Capito, I think to her credit, at least stood up and said, wait, that needs to be fixed. But all too often, we don't hear anything from our elected leaders, and it's just happening passively.
Any thoughts, speculation, roadmaps for the Democratic Party in West Virginia for the future?
Yeah, that's a tougher question too. It's going to take time, right? And not to turn this into a Democratic discussion, but I am a Democrat. I'm proud to be a Democrat, and for the party to get back to to become competitive again in West Virginia, we have to start small. We got to work locally, right? Win local elections, win mayor's races, city council, House of Delegates, and work our way up. And it's a real branding issue. Now, the challenge, again, it goes to these incentive structures. Every race in our country now is nationalized, right? Governor Manchin, who I work for, Senator Manchin, when I was appointed, Governor Manchin's approval rating was 70%. Like we had polled it that spring or something, it was 70%. When he announced for the Senate, they did a poll head-to-head with his Republican opponent, and it was 49-49. So he's asking, where'd that 20% go, right? Where's my 21 points? And it's because just immediately, within the context of especially federal seats, everything's nationalized, and we conflate every race with someone on the other side in some other state that we don't like.
There's time for one
Sir.
more question.
This has to do with what's happening right now, and I'm not. This has to do with what's happening at the present, and I'm wondering where it plays with the Constitution. Those people who are being rounded up today and yesterday and tomorrow for either being illegals or homeless, whatever. Are they being read their rights before they're taken away to wherever they're housed or imprisoned? I know that when my son was serving in Iraq, they had a unit which was composed of attorneys and police officers. And every time they went out looking for the enemy and they rounded people up, many of them were terrorists, but they weren't in uniform. They were just bad guys. They had to write up the reasons for their arrest and given their rights. Are we doing that today? And if not, what happens?
I don't know if they're doing that, but obviously I've seen a lot of the stories that we all have about some of these actions, and they're concerning. The ones that particularly concern me are where you have documented instances where the agencies and the officers are violating binding court orders. A court order says this person cannot be sent to that place, and they send them. Now that is a crisis. That is an instance in which the separation of powers is not being respected. And each branch has to jealously guard their prerogatives by ensuring that, or in the case of the courts, that the orders that they enter are followed.
Well, thank you to the audience for your questions. We do have one more on behalf of our team, being a younger team. What's your advice for young people right now who feel disillusioned with government? If you talk to a college student here on campus, they have the same association for Congress that they do for the DMV. It's, I don't want to go, I don't want to know about it, and
Takes too long, right?
it's a negative idea. So how can we get in? What's the loop in for us, the incentive? The Senate sounds cool. It's the world's greatest deliberative body that none of us really know anything about. So what can we do to kind of save our democracy?
Well, get involved. I mean, if folks are first, I would encourage everyone to become interested, right? And that starts with civics education, to find a better way to make sure everyone is coming up armed with this sort of familiarity with how our process works and what it means and why it's important and why it requires an engaged citizenry. And so for young people, we have to do that work with them, right, on the front end. But if you're interested, find an opportunity to get involved. Volunteer for a campaign. Come to events like this. I mean, hopefully I wasn't too boring for some of the students in the crowd, but find an outlet. I'm sure there are advocacy groups on campus that appeal to different folks. I know there are party groups. and there's opportunities to get involved in elections and campaigns of all sorts. And I would encourage everybody to take a look at that and take advantage of it.
Thank you. Let's please give one last big round of applause for Senator Carte Goodwin. And there's light refreshments outside, everyone.